to today's seminar on border closures in East and Central Africa. Today we have Hugh Lamarque from Edinburgh with us. Hugh is a political scientist with a doctorate in politics from the University of London, SOAS. He worked previously, amongst others, at the United Nations Development Programme as well as the World Bank. He is part of the executive committee of the African Borderlands Research Network and is also the Africa editor of the Journal of Borderlands Studies. Apart from that, he's also the co-editor of a book with Paul Nugent on transport corridors in Africa, and you are currently the Leverhulme Research Fellow at the University of Edinburgh Centre for African Studies. Hugh, the floor is yours. You will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we will have time for questions and answers.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. We talk a lot about the Leiden Centre of African Studies. It's got this fantastic reputation. I had a really good conversation with some of the graduate students earlier, so it really is just very exciting to be here. See if this works. Is that all online? Okay. Yeah, I'd like to start just by going backwards in time a bit, kind of right back to the distant past of 2019, which I think to many of us feels like a long time ago, and specifically to kind of early to mid-February 2019. And back at this period, there was a large outbreak of EVD, which is Ebola virus disease. That's the kind of World Health Organization's acronym. In these towns of Beni and Butembo. I'm sorry, the text is a bit small, but up in the top left of this image. And this was at the time, and it remains the second largest outbreak of EVD in history, just behind the very large outbreak in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone back in 2013 and 2014. It was a particularly concerning outbreak. It was a very virulent strain. It was killing approximately 50% of adults who were infected and 70 or 80% of children. And at the same time, it was spreading quite quickly. It was doubling every couple of weeks. It had been burning on since the previous summer by this point. There was a sense of complacency. There was a sense of a kind of Ebola fatigue at the time, perhaps a little bit of Congo fatigue in the news. I got the impression a little bit that the existence of an Ebola vaccine at this point, and the sense that, well, if we could get through 2013, 2014, we could get through this one, was kind of prevalent in people's minds. But aside from what it was and what our reaction to it was, maybe what was most difficult about this case was where it was. That these towns and the surrounding villages in Beni and Butembo are kind of archetypal of a borderland space, which is something that I was talking with the department about earlier. Some of the difficulties of this as an operating environment for developmental policy and for humanitarian interventions, that I was saying at the time, really, if you just spun a globe and threw a dart at it, it would be relatively difficult to find a harder place to run this kind of humanitarian operation than this particular part of North Kivu in Eastern Congo. In terms of borderland dynamics, it's got a very large circulation of people, including across these borders. On top of that, it's got a very large diversity of kind of ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, and linguistic diversity. That makes this community outreach, community engagement very difficult. At the very least, you have to do it in a number of different languages simultaneously. But on top of that, you've also got to navigate the politics and sometimes the conflictual politics between groups in this area. Simultaneously, the relationship between this part of North Kivu and the central Congolese state is very fractured by a long fractured history. Kinshasa is 1,500 kilometers away to the west and has always struggled to project its authority into North Kivu. Going back through the Mobutu era, there was this famous pronouncement, débrouillez-vous, sort of fend for yourselves, which is locally spoken about as being Article 15 of the Congolese Constitution. There are 14 articles in the Congolese Constitution, but there's definitely a sense that this is detached from central Congolese politics and a great deal of suspicion about central state actors coming into this area, as well as external actors. And kind of rightly so, that particularly when it comes to an EVD response, if community engagement is relatively restricted, your encounters with the state are often land cruisers with military officials in them, as well as people in full PPE, not just the masks from COVID, but the full sort of frog suits, who enter into a village and essentially take very sick people away, who more often than not are not coming back. This breeds all kinds of distrust, of resentments, and local rumors, which would then circulate a lot on WhatsApp and would circulate a lot on kind of local, often unregulated radio, and it was very hard to deal with these counter narratives. So one of the biggest concerns was that sooner or later, a positive Ebola case was going to get onto a bus and travel down this sort of orange road you can see on the side and reach the city of Goma. This seemed like one of the more likely scenarios. Goma is a city of just over or just under 1 million people. Population fluctuates a lot. But just the sheer weight of people in Goma would put many more people at risk. The fact that Goma borders another city, Gisenyi in Rwanda, with an enormous amount of cross-border interaction between the two, introduced the possibility of cross-border transmission at a much higher likelihood. And also then from Goma, the disease was more likely to make large jumps. It could jump to Kigali, a city of another 1 million people. It could follow one of these roads up to Kampala, potentially 3.2 million people. Or it could cross the Lake Kivu, and get down to Bukavu, again, just under 1 million people. These large jumps were real risk. At the time, I was working with an organization called the Social Science and Humanitarian Action Platform. This was a group that basically took specialist researchers and in conjunction with the WHO, the Wellcome Trust, UNICEF, and some others, it was a big consortium, was producing briefing papers for first responders on a series of topics in this area. And there were briefing papers, health-seeking behavior, these very short, data-rich, sort of informative pieces, one on burial practices, and what I was working on, which was on border dynamics. Don't worry about reading this, the text is deliberately small. The paper on border dynamics was basically trying to map out who crossed the border, where they crossed the border, and why they crossed the border, as a sort of added piece of information that the emergency response would be able to better understand contact tracing and better understand the dynamics of play back and forth across the border. And one of the issues that kept persistently coming up in conversations was, is there going to be a situation in which the borders, the Ugandan Congolese border and the Rwandan Congolese border, will be closed as response to the spread of this disease? Under what circumstances would that policy potentially be appropriate? These conversations. And it was interesting to hear the reaction at the time. The reaction at the time was basically uniformly no, and under no circumstance would this policy be appropriate. But it was fascinating to hear the different perspectives, the different justifications for that no. So the World Health Organization's line was basically, we tried this. This was policy in Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone. It didn't work. What tended to happen was that it would force people onto unregulated border crossings where contact tracing was impossible. They said people still cross the border. The difference that closing the border made is you didn't know where they crossed the border, and they deliberately avoided state representatives, including healthcare specialists. If you spoke to DFID, the World Bank, the Howard Buffett Association, Trademark East Africa, groups that were investing in cross-border trade, they had a very different perspective. They basically said, don't do it under any circumstance because of the socioeconomic damage that it would cause. So Goma and Gisenyi, if you go back, Gisenyi is just across the border from Goma here. This is the most crossed border point in Africa, arguably, statistics vary, but somewhere between 15,000 and 50,000 on very busy days, people cross the border freely here. Up and down the length of the border, the estimates run into the hundreds of thousands, mid-hundreds of thousands, predominantly women, predominantly trading in foodstuff on the Congolese side of the border. And so the line about border closures was, if you close the border, you will put these people out of the survival economy of several dollars a day. You will put the people who purchase food from them potentially out of food. And you will also put their dependents. And there were studies that suggested that these women had on average between 3 and 5 dependents. out of access to money and food as well. So the notion was a really catastrophic language. If you spoke to UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, or IOM, their line was more simple. They said, we're about getting people out of dangerous places, not in a sense sealing them in. And then if you spoke to governments, there was a more muted response. I think essentially what I heard in conversation with local municipal authorities was, we're not quite sure if we could. That this could provoke a backlash, again, to do with the economic damage that it would cause, that we're not entirely sure that we will be able to control. And it would also cause a strain on diplomatic relations across the border. There's an implicit assumption in closing the border that the DR Congo is unable somehow to manage this disease. So what happened as a result of that is I wrote the report up, and that's what it got on border closure. It got a single paragraph. And the paragraph basically says this is very unlikely. Some contingency planning might be needed, but we don't see this as something that's particularly likely to happen. There's very little precedent for it. And then on the 28th of February, the Rwandan government closed the border. But they didn't close it with Congo. They closed it with Uganda, which at the time had absolutely 0 cases of EBD. Now, the reasoning for this is complicated. Originally, the explanation was that they were expanding a road at a place called Gatuna, which is one of the main trading corridors through into Uganda. The border stayed closed for 2 or 3 days, and then over time, it gradually came out that this was not the explanation. The explanation is more complicated and to do with elite level politics between Uganda and Rwanda. That members, I don't want to get too far into it, but members of the Rwandan opposition were said to have been holding meetings with senior Ugandan officials. The Rwandan government was very uncomfortable with this, requested that it stopped. The Ugandan government for a certain time denied it. And at some point, the Rwandan government's kind of punitive measure was to shut the border and sever ties with Uganda. And it just forced me to step back. You have these 2 borders, one of which is at risk of Ebola transmission and one of which is this high-level politics, and it was closed. Now, there aren't any very large cities on this border, so the socioeconomic damage wasn't the same, I suppose, as if it had been on the Congolese border. But it was still, I think, harmful, as all border closures are. This happened, and I really did take a step back, and I said, this was very surprising. I don't really understand border closures. How can I? And I got into the archives of the Africa Borderlands Research Network. Now, this is a group of scholars, many of them from Africa, working at African institutions, but what binds them together is that they work on borderland issues. And this has been around since about 2007. Over time, it built up a database of a sort of bibliography of all of the research that have been published by these scholars, as well as the reading lists that they then provided to their students. So it's a very large database of reading. Not a single one of them was on the topic of border closures. And as far as I could find, not a single one of them actually made reference to border closures. So I thought, well, this is very surprising with, you know, the lack of theory on this in this case. And looking around the continent, I found some other examples. The Nigeria-Benin example we were talking about earlier, which is extending on and off to this day. What I tried to do, really for curiosity's sake, was to map out border closures since the year 2000 in Africa. And so this chart shows sort of an alphabetical list of all countries in mainland Africa on the X and Y axis. And you can see 210 green squares. That's every border on the continent. I note that in this example, we'll talk about it later, but the Uganda-Kenya border is different from the Kenya-Uganda border. That is actually deliberate, and it's important in terms of border openings. But what you think of as a single line of a border is actually 2 borders running next to each other. You cross the Uganda border, you cross an area of so-called no man's land, then you cross the Kenyan border. So these things link up, and if you compress them into pairs, you have 105. If you expand them into these individual borders, you have 210. And I started to try to put together cases and try to establish a typology of causes, and came up loosely with this, that they could be caused by public health, which was similar to what went on in Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, but also not just to humans, but also to livestock was another relatively common one. For starters, there were not many cases of this. I'll get into why later on. They could be for security reasons. Maybe a prime example would be Eritrea and Ethiopia at that period. Economic protection, loosely speaking, Nigeria and Benin. Control of migration, political disputes. Control of migration, I suppose there are examples from North Africa in cases essentially where, pressured by the EU, countries such as Algeria and others had introduced new restrictions at their borders. Political disputes, Rwanda and Uganda being a key example. And then interestingly, one I'd never thought of, which is elections. For a lot of states in Africa, on election day, borders are nominally closed. And there were interesting examples of this in Ghana between Aflao and Togo. The border was closed ostensibly to prevent people from the Togolese side coming over and interfering, so-called registering somehow on the day and voting in Ghanaian elections. Excuse me. I've just written the word problems and I've underlined it. This typology was enormously overlapping. It was very, very difficult to code and isolate individual cases into particular rationales. What I had in mind that I wanted to do was to try and correlate this against, for example, the duration of closures, and maybe make some glib comment that borders that are closed for security reasons tend to be closed for shorter periods of time. It became impossible and not necessarily all that interesting to do this. And really what this revealed for me was basically one, that governments are often insincere about their rationales, and that information about border closures is very difficult to get a hold of, very difficult to kind of internalize and work out reasons why. Then COVID happened, and more or less all of these borders underwent a high degree of restriction. Not all of them, the word closed I'm deliberately avoiding there, but suddenly the database just exploded. It grew enormously. There were at least as many, if not many, many more closures that were taking place in 2020 than I had in the entire database that I gathered up until that point. So the database expands, but the reasons in the database compress enormously. That suddenly we're really just talking about COVID closures. And that depressed me. I got caught up in other work, and I kind of stood away and abandoned the database for the time being. And it was only a few years later that I came back to this issue of closures, having seen, what went on 2020, 2021, as this became a dominant feature of all of our lives. And I tried to come up, instead of with a typology, I tried to come up with some sort of analytical framework for understanding what these closures are, what they mean in reality, and also a functional definition in terms of trying to understand what they do. And this arrived eventually at these two, I'm calling them checklists for the time being, for understanding and comparing closures. These are the notion of incompleteness and the notion of asymmetry. And I'll talk through both of these in a second. These checklists, by that I mean, if there is a case of a border closure, these result in lists of things to go through to try and understand how it's working, and also potentially a loose basis for comparing them. Not comparing them based on some government explanation of why they took place, but trying to compare them on the basis of a more systematic look at what they were and what they did. Two comments before I get into that. One is about border closures and ideology. When you work on an issue as sensitive as this, and it is politically sensitive, people make assumptions, I suppose, about ideology. I am in no way proposing border closures. And I'm certainly not giving any kind of handbook for how border closures should take place. If I delved into my own ideology of it, all I have is the experience of collating these things. And my experience of collating them just shows that all border closures cause harm. They necessarily cause harm. Some of them also, to a certain degree, prevent harm. But what you find yourself doing, even in discussing a border closure, is this balance of evils. And I don't think anyone is in favor of, well, certainly not me, border closures for their own sake at all. And secondly, border closures and legitimacy, and this might seem to pull in the opposite direction, but I've sat in on meetings where people have discussed the quote-unquote legitimacy of border closures. And I think it's the wrong word to use. I think generally people talk about the legitimacy of border closures when what they mean is whether or not they're inappropriate, whether or not they're ineffectual, whether or not they're likely to do more harm than good. The word legitimacy causes some issues, because if you're particularly in meetings where there are representatives of the authorities who are implementing border closures. It tends to be a decision that's made at the very top of the executive branch, at the presidential level. And it's also so centralized stated, the idea of this control of borders, whether they're open or not, that to have an external actor in any way imply that doing something with the state's border is quote unquote illegitimate, often had a habit of very badly putting people's backs up and resulted in a great deal of resentment and resistance. Okay, incompleteness. What is a closed border? As I came into the room, someone wonderfully said at the back, no borders are ever closed. That is more or less my take on this. Incompleteness is about the idea that all border closures are to some degree partial, that it is a dial, it is not a switch. Borders are not simply open or closed. But to get to that, you have this issue of how we visualize borders in the first place. In our heads, I think a lot of the time, borders exist mentally as pictures of maps with lines on them. And that's completely detached from reality. When you think in terms of reality, you then get a secondary mental image a lot of the time of a border checkpoint, of a place with soldiers and gates and fences. If you go to the overwhelming majority of the 80,000 kilometer border network in Africa, you will find nothing there. You will most likely see a field. You will not see anything referencing the border. So these metaphors that we use can be a little bit misleading about what borders actually are in reality and how they actually look in reality. They also lead us into the language of barriers. The borders in this way are often described as things that block. And even a sort of cursory look at this, you see in general that borders often influence things, pull things across them. They tend to be conduits. But this use of metaphor spills over into how we understand border closures. I think when I speak generally with policymakers on the matter, I get the impression that they have a mental image of the state as a house and the border as a wall around it, and the border posts as doors in that wall. And if you want to close the and it's either open or closed in that sense. And I think even a sort of cursory inspection of border closures in reality, even a cursory inspection of that metaphor shows everything that's wrong with it. Because you then have to ask, well, are there other doors? Are there other doors that you don't know about? Can people potentially climb over the wall itself? Are there other ways in? Is the door locked from the inside? Is it locked from the outside? Is it locked in both directions? Can you yourself enter and leave the house? Could someone outside in desperate need enter into the house? And so on. So this whole notion, this whole idea of an on-off switch, open or closed, just seems wrong. And that resulted in a checklist then of the partiality along different axes, different dials of partiality. And these go this way. By nation, well, which border is closed? If each border is two borders, generally when a border is nominally closed, only one side is officially closed, because the other side doesn't need to. By geography, where is the border closed? This is a more controversial one. I mean, this is really the dial, not a switch issue. If you go to the Uganda-Kenya border and you find that all of the border posts are closed except the border at Busia, would you say that the border with Uganda is closed? If the Busia border is also closed, but there are 10 flights a day back and forth between Nairobi and Kampala, in that situation, would you say that the border is closed? It's a very difficult issue to come to terms with, the degree of restriction in terms of geography. Similarly, by direction, right now at the Rwanda-Congo border, or at least actually at the start of the border closure, people were allowed to pass, but only to pass in one direction, returning home. And that was a common feature during COVID. But there are border closures that allow passage in one direction and not the other. It's a relatively common feature. By status might be the wrong word, by socioeconomic profile. Borders are almost never closed to everyone. Even at the very, very pinnacle of the lockdown in Kigali, I could still see some of the quarantine hotels where presumably diplomats or military officials were still traveling in and out of the country, even when the airport was closed. There is still always some necessary interactions that cross borders that tend to override these things. By duration and time, when is the border closed? This one is a little bit diverted, but this gets into that question of election closures. A lot of borders are closed at night. We don't really think about that as a closure. But there seems to be a separate category of border closures, which is border closures when the date of reopening is already fixed. So when you know the time that the border is going to open back up. And that will be things like borders closed at elections, borders closed at certain festivals, national holidays, and borders closed potentially at night or at particular times of day. And then finally, this question, is the border really closed at all? And the final thing with that metaphor, do the locks work on the doors? That if you say that a border is closed, but 30,000 people are walking across it every day anyway, is it actually closed at all? Which again comes back to the comments as I entered the room. I think this was a very, very common feature of nominally closed borders over the course of the last 3 years. I'm a bit conscious of time, so I'll move through this part relatively quickly. But the second concept is this concept of asymmetry. And it comes from the question of what does a border closure do in reality? It's a functional description of how they operate. And it's a functional description in the first place of a way of understanding borders and border effects. That borders mark differences between different things in any sense, including international territorial borders. And across any international or most international borders, you have this levels of cross-border interaction. That's how many people, goods, and capital cross the border. And all I'm saying here really is that cross-border interaction, the movement of people, goods, and capital, produces asymmetry. It's first a response to asymmetry. People cross because something is different on the other side. But as they cross to do that, it changes the profile of the two sides in ways that become entrenched and more permanent, in ways that can tend towards greater differences over time. And so you have asymmetry producing interaction and interaction producing asymmetry at the same time. And it produces gradients of difference across borders. I appreciate this is quite abstract, but at some level, the price of a tomato on one side being 3 cents higher than the price of a tomato on the other side is a gradient in price. That drives an enormous amount of interaction across the border. The price of rent on one side being higher than the other drives interaction across the border. And it's not the absolute values that's doing that. It's the discrepancy between the two values. It's the difference. And I personally have argued elsewhere that this then extends to other components of an urban environment, particularly in urban borderlands, including physical safety and security, that crime rates on both sides of a border are coupled together. And the changes in crime rates on one side of the border are likely to influence crime rates on the other side of the border, potentially in unpredictable ways, but seemingly in a way that's a kind of dialectic that produces greater asymmetry over time, rather than simply leveling out. And there are many cross-border characteristics that get this sort of crude kitchen scale here, more imbalanced over time, rather than leveled out over time. This then produces a checklist of asymmetries that I think talks about the function of a closure. This is the final step. And these are the ones that I've laid out in the sort of mental checklist that I go through when I look at a border and I look at a border closure. One of the foundational questions is, what is the gradient of difference in the population sizes and densities on either side of the border? Now, whether or not that's going to change or be uncoupled if a border is closed, potentially, but more than the uncoupling, that forms a bedrock for understanding systems of exchange across the board. If one side is much larger than the other, it creates certain particular differences there. Secondly, infrastructure. If you have, I mean, particularly large stadiums, large airports on one side of the border, but not the other. If you have items of infrastructure that are used by people from the other side of the border, then it sort of goes without saying that if the border is, if their interaction with that is severed, then their behavior on their side of the border is likely to change. Something needs to be adapted there. The same applies to services, imbalances in health, education, leisure, financial institutions. If there was an interaction that required the use of those services from the other side and a border is closed, people are going to have to adapt in ways that may be unpredictable, maybe modelable in some senses, but the point here is that the gradients will become uncoupled from one another. An imbalance in the cost or provision of healthcare on either side of the border, once uncoupled, will no longer move in conjunction with the other side and will no longer be able to drive interactions across the border. And so these two things are likely to start changing independently of one another. The same goes for the cost of living, rents and market prices of food. Now, if that tomato costs $1 on one side, it won't, but that's a just for the sake of it, and $1.50 on the other side, you can see that those prices are linked to each other, particularly if people are buying from one side and reselling on the other, which is one of the most common forms of exchange, informal food exchange. If the border is closed, obviously people don't have access to that revenue, but going beyond that, the prices of those tomatoes on either side of the border become uncoupled from one another and can move in different ways independently and can change the dynamic, the markets, the way people behave, and the unemployment rates as well. Unemployment rates are also balanced against each other and can become uncoupled. I've talked about physical security and crime statistics. This was really what I was discussing in my own PhD some years ago, was looking at the way that crime is relative on either sides of borders and can often move as a response. And then I've put in governance here, that if people are living in a system, for example, two cities that are connected, with very different governance styles on either side of the border, that they are often living in a way where they will take advantage of the positive benefits of certain aspects of governance on their side of the border, but then be able to cross the border and take advantage of elements of governance on the other side. And if you close the border entirely, it often results in people responding differently to their own municipal authorities. They no longer have options, essentially, and this causes changes of behavior. So just to wrap up here, we're looking at, first off, an attitude shift, I think, is going on. But as recently as 3 years ago, border closures in general were a real nuclear option. They were very unthinkable. The advice against them was extremely, extremely harsh. Pretty well every country on the continent, pretty well every country in the world has now got experience of doing this. So the practical questions about whether or not it's possible have to a certain degree been answered. This is a bell that kind of can't be unrung. And we're seeing already that as borders are being opened in different places, they're again being reclosed for other reasons. This seems to be happening more prominently and more commonly than it did before COVID. Similarly, I talked a bit about justifications. I mean, my only comment on that remains to this day that justifications very often overlap and can quite commonly be insincere. So looking just at these justifications, I don't know how far it gets us. But then I've presented these two checklists based on these concepts of incompleteness and asymmetry. This is that closures are partial, you cannot have a complete closure, and then again that asymmetry causes kind of interactions, responds to interactions, and has the capacity to change the character of the border itself from the perspective of communities living close to it, as certain aspects of those environments become uncoupled from one another. And then I put as a final bullet point here, this is sort of for future research, that in my own research now, I'm moving to try and look at kind of empirical evidence from border openings across the continent. We didn't really have so many border openings until relatively recently, but this nominal idea of reopening checkpoints. And there's an argument here that this is actually more difficult in certain aspects than closing a border. That opening borders requires bilateral coordination between both states. Closing the border can, in a sense, be done unilaterally. So this is a much more political exercise. It requires synchronization between often security forces. So it's interesting at a theoretical level, and it's very challenging at a practical level, and it's next steps. And I'll stop there. Thank you again. It's great.